Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Melissa Lott, and I'm the Director of Research and a Senior Research Scholar here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Amy Myers Jaffe, who's a research professor and managing director at the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University's Fletcher School, and also the co-chair of our Women in Energy Steering Committee here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Today, we're going to be discussing her new book, Energy's Digital Future, Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security. And I don't know if we could have been more timely with this book, or if you could have been more timely with this book, Amy, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So today we're going to start with a presentation by Amy about her new book, and then we'll follow that with some brief remarks from Professor Jason Bordoff, who's the co-founding dean of the Climate School here at Columbia, and also founding director of CGEP, in addition to David Sandalow, who's the CGEP Inaugural Fellow. So with that, I'm going to ask Amy to join us, and I'll pass it over for her presentation. And what I'll say is after we have those introductory remarks, we will go to a moderated Q&A session, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you are joining us via Zoom, please do go ahead and submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I'll quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. So again, with that, I will hand things over to Amy.
Well, thank you very much, Melissa. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am going to share my screen because I have some visuals. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Center for Global Energy Policy for publishing this book as part of their book series, great book series. Recommend all the other books in the series as well. Today, I'm going to be talking about digital. What do I mean by digital? By that, I mean computerized, AI, 3D printing, automated vehicles, automated everything. And we're going to discuss what it means for the future. And I think we got a little preview today, because let me just say that the Colonial Pipeline had a lot of things automated, everything from how much oil moves in and out of a tank at what time, to, of course, their billing program and their office organization, which we now know had a cyber hack. So cyber hack is a big part of thinking about the surface area that the digital future is going to bring, and how we're going to have a higher range of things linked together by devices. Just think, Alexa, do this for me, Alexa, do that for me. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that's going to mean and how it's going to affect US foreign policy and what we need to do as a nation. So I have three major digital takeaways that I want to discuss with you today. The first one is, just because digital technologies are convenient and we're all using GPS and we're all giving voice commands to our at-home systems, doesn't mean these technologies aren't strategic or dual use. And one of the big challenges in energy and the digitization of our energy system is that all of these technologies have military applications, and therefore the competition in them becomes one of national security. Second theme of the book, major digital takeaway, is that these digital technologies can help us lower oil use and lower greenhouse gas emissions, but only if we apply them that way. If we use them to get 1 hour deliveries from a diesel truck from Amazon, and that truck's going to drive around like a warehouse, obviously that's going to greatly enhance emissions, not reduce them, by optimization programs that mean that people don't have to drive to 100 stores to look for something, but Amazon can bunch packages together to minimize the amount of footprint they have and use an electrified vehicle. And then the last theme from the book, big takeaway, is that the geopolitics of the energy transition is going to be very different than the oil and gas paradigms we're used to, and the kind of energy weapons that might be brought to bear will be different, as we can see with this disruption to the Colonial Pipeline. So I like to tell people we are in a Sputnik moment. And by that, I mean, for those of you maybe generationally, Sputnik was the launch of a Soviet satellite that meant that maybe the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in its technology to space. And that had huge strategic ramifications, which were grasped immediately in the United States. And we launched a $30 billion technology effort called the space race. Now, today, China is actually the leading nation in having a national strategic offensive in digital automation and clean tech. They have made it a concerted national operation. Europe just announced a $1 trillion clean energy battery initiative, basically looking to secure their own manufacturing and supply chains for clean tech to be able to position themselves to be secure in their pursuit of the energy transition. And then, of course, I have here in red, United States, question mark, question mark, question mark, because we have not begun. Not to say there aren't things about this in the Biden infrastructure bill, or that we didn't throw a couple $1 million here and a couple $1 million there on some of these technologies, which I'll talk about in my presentation. But there's this attitude in the United States that, you know, it needs to be left to the private sector. And indeed, you know, Amazon and Facebook and Apple are spending $160 billion on R&D. But then the question is that adequate to our national security to have private companies? And will private companies make the kind of strategic investments that are needed? Or will they look down the road to, you know, certain commercial applications that might not meet society's goals? And therefore, a public sector participation is important, especially when it comes to national security. And not to knock Facebook, but we can all remember the days when Facebook and Twitter were talking about their important role in democracy promotion worldwide. And I don't think anybody sees it that way now. And so that is why we have to think carefully about, as we digitize, what are the national security implications? What are the human rights and democracy implications? And how do we get these tools to be used in the way that aligns with our values? So time to step it up. As you can see, just having the DOE handle energy R&D has not provided consistent level of funding, and we're not getting where we need to get. A couple US R&D facts for those of you who might be listening and say, no, she's wrong, the private sector is doing a great job. All of you who are using GPS, that was a technology developed by the Pentagon to track the Sputnik satellite. Space race, $30 billion. So I know that there's some 200 million allocation for cybersecurity in the budget this year, but that is not close to what we put allocated to the space race. Here's a fact I bet nobody knew. In 2001, the National Defense Authorization Act wanted a third of all US ground combat vehicles to be automated by 2015. Don't think we're close to that. I defer, but it doesn't seem like it. It was the Pentagon that had a contest in 2002 following that authorization in the Mojave Desert to have a automated vehicle do a race course. And indeed, that is how we have all the, you know, sort of Waymo technologies, because all the people who entered that contest later became leaders in self-driving technology in Silicon Valley. And here's my point about the private sector versus public sector incentive and funding. And that is, today in the United States, you can have a pizza delivered by a robot vehicle somewhere in the United States, and you maybe in Houston, for example, you can have your groceries delivered by Nuro and there's no driver. But we just had a major hack of one of the most, if not the most important piece of fuel delivery system infrastructure in the United States. So on my other theme about, you know, what could this mean about global oil demand? As Jason has always said, global oil demand is very sticky, even under COVID, where everybody was locked down and urban commuting was really at a standstill for a period of time. The impact on oil demand and emissions was a little disappointingly small. I mean, it was big from the point of view of the impact on industry, but from the point of view of a climate strategy, when you're thinking that you don't want to have extreme changes like that, it really highlighted how difficult a challenge we have. And here at Columbia, we did a set of scenarios where we looked at different ways the markets might respond when we come out of the COVID pandemic. And one of them, called forced revitalization, was a scenario where all major governments, China, the United States, Europe, Japan, implement green stimulus and really make a push to digital technology. And as you can see, by 2030, that would eliminate, almost 10% of oil demand by 2030. So digital is a very powerful tool to use less oil, but it's not a magic wand. And last point on the changing geopolitics is that, if we move down the full path of energy mitigation, which we're talking about really decarbonizing, deep decarbonization, most of the deep decarbonization scenarios, and this slide has one from ARENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, shows about 50% of 50% of energy will come through the form of electrification by 2050. That means we're going to have a lot of imbalanced markets where renewables from one place are balanced by different kinds of capacities and energy sources from another place through a lot of cross-border electricity trade. We're already seeing that in Europe. That could mean less reliance on the sea lanes for oil transit. But then it becomes a question about, can I keep those networks secure? If I'm trading across countries, do I have to worry about, is there anybody in my electricity network that could turn into a hostile nation and try to use electricity shutdowns or as a coercive tool? And then what would be the remedy? Because having the US Navy come, unless they have lithium batteries and quickly to install utility solar panels like we did in Puerto Rico with Tesla's battery and solar panel mix, which they were able to do in 3 days to get a hospital online. Unless we have something like that, or we're going to turn to hydrogen as our sort of means of reserve energy for renewables, we have to think about if electricity is the new oil, what is the actual remedy to make sure that there is no coercion or energy weapon. And that means that cybersecurity superiority is what's going to make nations powerful relative to each other. And I think we can kind of understand that idea better today than we could have last week.
Thank you, Amy. Really appreciate that presentation. And again, congratulations on your book, which is now out in the world for all of us to read after your, I think, 2 years of work, if I'm not mistaken. So thanks for all that hard work and putting it into the book. And I'm now going to hand things over to Jason Bordoff, for a few just initial thoughts on the book and what you've spoken about. Jason?
Thanks, Melissa. Great to be with you and Amy and David. Amy, congratulations on the book. We are really proud here at the Center on Global Energy Policy to have it in our book series, and holding it right here, and it's great. Encourage people to read it. Still has the sticky note with my name on it from when you left it for me with a nice inscription. Thank you. And looking at the book series, because in the beginning we have the books in our series kind of listed, and I see our friend Bob McNally and crude volatility, one on the fracking debate, one on the use of sanctions, potential overuse of sanctions. I think what I'm proud of in looking at those titles is how many of them are thinking ahead to what might be coming around the corner and getting ahead of issues and seeing how trends are going to evolve as the energy system transitions. And I think this book falls very squarely in that category, thinking about the role that digital technologies will play and all the counterintuitive, unanticipated consequences that could come from that. So just want to congratulate you for this, and really delighted we could have this event. Sorry we can't do it in person to celebrate the release of this book. Listening to you talk about it, I was jotting down some notes, and I think there were 2 points I'll comment on. One is what you said about China and competition and industrial policy, and the second on geopolitics. So, you suggested this was a Sputnik moment and we need to win. And that may be right. I think it would be important to have discussion here and continued about why that is. Economic, national security, for the climate imperative we face. The traditional argument against industrial policy to combat climate change is that government can't anticipate which technologies will deliver the cheapest solutions. But moreover, some critics of that, and we should come back to what we mean by industrial policy, would argue that if the goal is to reduce emissions as fast as possible, it should matter less where the technology is made than whether it is as cheap as possible, so more people will adopt it. Jason Furman, who Melissa and David and I worked with in the Obama administration, wrote that recently. If you think climate change is the biggest challenge facing the country, you should want a lot of solar and wind energy produced in the US. You shouldn't care nearly as much where the panels and turbines are produced. Is he right? And if not, why not? And I think there are good arguments against what he's saying, and you lay some of those out in the book. I will say I wrote a piece recently in Foreign Policy in which I suggested he might be wrong, not only for reasons of economic competitiveness and jobs and national security and supply chains, but I made the argument that that actually might be what climate leadership looks like, right? The US is only 15% of global emissions. From now until the end of the century, probably going to be only around 5% of the growth in emissions. So our greatest contribution to climate change may not only be to get our own house in order and begin slashing emissions, as the Biden NDC suggests we must, but also to drive down the cost of the technologies that the rest of the world is going to need to help us get there, particularly low-income countries that are not responsible for this problem to date, because carbon emissions are total cumulative amount in the atmosphere is what matters. It's a stock, not a flow problem. Africa is responsible for 2% of the stock, and the United States 25% of the stock. Those economies are going to continue to grow, will need more energy, and will not only need renewable energy for electricity, but are going to need hydrogen and carbon capture technologies and long duration storage technologies until long distance trucking, things that are not where they need to be in terms of commercial availability or affordability today. To the extent the US invests early in some of those technologies, we can not only be large suppliers of them and dominate some of those industries, much the same way China made a decision 15 or so years ago to do that, say, with batteries and solar panels, but also help to drive down those costs in order to make it more feasible that other countries around the world would be able to adopt them. So I'd like to come back to the question of why we think it is a Sputnik moment in that sense. Then the question is, what does industrial policy look like? And people use that term to mean a lot of different things. Some of it is pretty standard, I think, in the sense of way many economists have often thought about identifying market failures and then having government step in to correct them. So dramatically increasing clean energy research and development funding to accelerate innovation. Subsidies that can lower the cost of clean energy technologies, a carbon price or some other mechanism to increase the cost of carbon intensive alternatives. Government can use its procurement power to create more demand or reduce risk for developers by signing long-term energy purchase agreements. David's written about that often. Low-cost loans or loan guarantees to support projects by lowering the cost of capital and the risk, infrastructure investment, as is being proposed now in DC, and streamline permitting to boost demand and overcome some of the chicken and egg problems. All of those things make a huge amount of sense, and many would characterize them as industrial policy. Tools of international economic policy, like trade, to align US competitiveness with an energy transition, clean energy export finance to help support US industries competing in the international market. All of these add up to what you might call industrial policy. I think from my standpoint, where that phrase borders into some things that cause more risk of backfiring if retaliatory measures are adopted by other countries in response would be some of the things like import tariffs and Buy America provisions, but we can come back to that. So that's sort of my broad reaction to what you said on the industrial policy and competitiveness side. The second thing you talked about was the geopolitical implications of this transition toward clean energy and digitalization. And there, I think you're right that it is certainly not going to look like the traditional way many people, you and me and others who've done a lot of scholarship on this, have thought about geopolitics as traditionally defined, often by way of an global oil and gas economy. We think about Nord Stream 2 and European dependence on Russian gas. We think about OPEC going back to the 1970s. So that will change, but if a particular country dominates the production of, say, solar panels or electric car batteries or other technologies, it doesn't necessarily derive the same measure of geopolitical influence that a country like, say, Saudi Arabia does by dominating not only oil supply because of how much it produces, but in that case, as you know, very better than anyone, by holding spare capacity and being able to respond to disruptions in the market as needed. The geopolitical leverage of the two is pretty different. So China may have power over a new market for clean energy equipment by producing it most cheaply. But if China curbed solar panel exports for geopolitical reasons, the lights would not go out. Restricting battery shipments may lead to higher prices, delays for new electric cars, but it wouldn't impact people's ability to get around in their vehicles today, the way we see with what's happening with the Colonial Pipeline. So those are some questions I think we should ask. And then there may be new geopolitical risks created, say, for example, by a growing seaborne trade in hydrogen or ammonia. Would that come with similar problems to conflict-prone shipping lanes or cybersecurity risks, as we're seeing with Colonial? So those are some of the questions that I think may apply in a clean energy economy as well.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate your comments there. And last, I should say last, but certainly not least, I'm going to hand things over to David Sandalow, our inaugural fellow here at CGEP, for your comments before we go into the moderated Q&A.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and congratulations, Amy, on this great book. This book underscores a basic rule of energy policy, which is read everything that Amy Myers Jaffe writes. I don't know anybody who writes with such depth on such a wide range of issues with such readable prose as Amy. And this book is a great example. This book covers topics ranging from the long ago history of the electric vehicle to grid technologies today, to automated vehicles, to three-dimensional printing, to China's rise, to US federal clean energy budgets, and does it just with a range of really interesting stories and compelling insights. So if you have even the remotest interest in these topics, I recommend picking it up, and you can read chapter by chapter the full book. It's a great contribution. I have a friendly amendment to your last slide, Amy. You said electricity will be the new oil. I would say electricity is already the new oil. I think we've seen the vulnerability of the conventional energy distribution system to electricity disruptions actually for a long time. Almost a decade ago with Superstorm Sandy in the New York area, we saw filling stations unable to supply gasoline because of electric outages, and we're seeing a version of that with Colonial today. I think electricity is already the new oil, meaning it's already a kind of critical choke point for our society as a whole. And as you write very compellingly in the book, the attack surface is only going to increase in the years ahead. I just like two issues that haven't been raised yet, which I think are related and really very interesting and important here. One of them is supply chains and supply chains for the materials that make up the digital energy ecosystem. The IEA is out with an important report last week, which talks about critical minerals and their role, and their conclusion is that disruptions or bottlenecks in supply chains for critical minerals could slow down the transition to clean energy. I think there's a number of important issues there. A number of important issues related to national policies and nationalism and the clean energy and digital energy technology industries. Jason was talking about those, but to the extent that we are making sure that production of these technologies happens in one country, that affects supply chains in a very important way. And then I think a growing trend, which we've seen in some sectors more than energy, is attention to ethical issues in supply chains. The garment industry for years now there's been a lot of social activism around fair labor standards and related issues. We haven't seen that as much in clean energy, and I think it's here and it's growing, looking at the use of forced labor and sourcing of clean energy technology materials. I think that's going to be an important trend. And then a second important trend that I think is growing and is closely related to everything Amy writes about are cryptocurrencies and energy. And Bitcoin has just reached $1 trillion market cap. Bitcoin didn't exist 13 years ago. There's now $1 trillion worth of Bitcoin out there. We have at least one public company is acknowledged buying $1 billion of Bitcoin for its treasuries. We have actually vehicle companies like Tesla saying they're going to take payment in Bitcoins. I just read the CEO of I think New York MetLife just announced that he's going on the board of NYDIG, which is a major Bitcoin trading company or a financial services company managing Bitcoin. And all of this is deeply related to energy consumption, because cryptocurrency mining, in particular Bitcoin mining, requires huge amounts of electricity. And so there's a lot of growing focus, I think, on the energy implications of cryptocurrencies, some concern about the amount of cryptocurrency mining that's happening using coal-fired power in China, and the emissions that could be associated with that. But then on the other hand, some very interesting businesses proposing to monetize the capture of associated gas in the Permian with Bitcoin mining, and using the power from that gas to run Bitcoin mining computers, helping to avoid the environmental damage associated with flaring. So a lot of very important issues. And Amy, I recall you've written about monetary policy in oil in the past. I think this issue of cryptocurrencies brings together monetary policy and energy policy and technology in a really interesting way. Maybe this could be your next project. Thanks a lot. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, David. Appreciate those comments. So before we launch into this moderated discussion, just for those of you who have joined us as we've continued this conversation, I want to say again, my name is Melissa Lott, and I'm here with Amy Myers Jaffe to talk about her new book, along with Jason Bordoff and David Sandalow. So Amy's new book is titled Energy's Digital Future. We're going to go through a few questions, and as the Q&A, evolves and all the different questions that you are submitting come in, many of them are parallel to the list that I had. So I think I'm just going to try to weave them in as we go through it all. But I wanted to kick things off, Amy. With the topic in your book, you explore how, as the energy world is becoming more digital, a number of technologies that we're developing, they leave us open to certain risks. And you highlight in your presentation, or you mentioned in the book, talking about what private organizations are doing to keep our systems secure. Could you speak up a little bit more about, in the United States, are we moving fast enough to respond to security challenges, and the role of governments and public funding to ensure not only that we are secure, but also ensure our competitiveness?
I think we're not moving fast enough, and we don't. I noticed today one of the private sector chairmen said there should be a NASA-like agency that actually manages this challenge with a high technical expertise, and maybe recruiting that seems more like the space race. So I like the analogy. Part of the problem is we're counting on the private sector. This problem with Colonial makes me feel a little bit Macondo-like we thought the oil industry had something under control, and now we learn that no, they are not invulnerable. They were asleep at the wheel, and the consequences, for millions of Americans could be quite severe if they want to try to get together for the holidays and this isn't resolved quickly. Hopefully it will be, and we won't get to that, but it highlights the opportunity that comes when you're not organized properly. And we have a very uneasy collaboration between the US government and private sector in this issue. US government itself has had its own problem with hacks. I just don't think, when you think of the amazing job that the US government has done vaccinating so many millions of Americans in such a short period of time, that took an amazing national effort. It shows that with excuse the expression, we still got it. And that's great news. So now it's, we have to continue with that, but we have to be able to multitask. And I wanted to respond to something Jason said, which I cover in the book. And, David kind of alludes to in talking about forced labor. There are different ways these technologies are being used in different societies. And one of the reasons why the United States has to get it right and lead is that, facial recognition software can be a great way to, initialize your entry into something for data security. But, used the wrong way, it can be a tremendous tool of repression. And we're seeing that, to name names, in China, where the surveillance society is very severe. And, you can imagine, you hear, stories about things that happen in that country where people are under surveillance. If they have any incorrect, quote unquote, intervention, they participate in a protest or what have you. All of this technology is brought to bear to stifle that. You get a cultural social score, and that can prevent you from owning a home, can prevent you from getting a job. And these tools were used in Venezuela. You weren't allowed to get food unless you had the digital card that allowed you to have food. And so it's not a small thing at stake. It's not even just about making sure that more Americans have jobs. It's also about making sure that we show the world how these technologies should be used, that the export of these technologies and to go to clean energy and respond to climate change should not be an invitation to have repression, like we saw in Venezuela, where literally access to food and water and security is 100% digitized and people have no rights. We can't afford to let fragile nations and the developing South move in that direction instead of the direction where these things are a tool to improve the human condition. And that is why the United States has to lead, and that is why it's critical. And that's why I say it's a Sputnik moment, because we're talking about, defending the very values that we say we stand for. And I like the idea of a NASA-like agency because I like the idea of trying to engage a younger generation into not gaming, but to actually use the skills and abilities that they have to ensure that not only do we have stronger national security, but we can offer that kind of world for others across the globe.
Could I jump into it?
Absolutely, David. Absolutely.
I just couldn't endorse what Amy is saying about U.S. leadership and its importance more. And we've written about this at the Center on Global Energy Policy, particularly in the area of clean energy innovation. And if you're interested in this, I recommend our book, Energizing America, which is both a big picture and then a very granular look at how the United States can take the lead in one part of this area, which is energy innovation for clean energy technologies. The history is compelling. The federal government has played a role, which Amy, central role, which Amy details in her book, and we talk about in Energizing America as well. And now is the time to seize that mantle. And I think there's promising signs in Washington. Some of the Biden budget proposals are very encouraging, but obviously they need to work their way through Congress in this regard. I think, we have a long history of federal government playing an important role, but we also have a deep anti-government part of our culture, a part of our political culture. And I think that can inhibit US competitiveness, that type of anti-government mentality. And it's been a tension in US history for a long time. And I think we need to recognize the proper role of the federal government in promoting clean energy innovation and digital energy technologies as part of the solution here.
And let's not forget, part of the role of government is to keep us safe. We had a dictator in North Korea determine that an American comedian could not release his film. That should worry every American. It should worry every American if foreign countries can tell me that this book, you can't read it. because there's some foreign government that doesn't want you to read it, and they're going to implement that through some, cyber means. That's a problem. Our government needs to be able to protect us, and that's the role of government. And obviously, we want to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with private enterprise, because, obviously private enterprise has, made America great, or, to phrase a phrase from the other side of the aisle. But, on the other hand, and that's why I have a chapter in the book on the history of the early 1900s, because World War I, I mean, one of the two big enabling technologies of World War I were mass production, which came from the automobile sector, and then, Edison, right? Edison was like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and the Apple guys rolled into one. Steve Jobs, all in one person in one lab. So, I'm not saying that. What happens with the private sector is getting the incentive from government to row in the same direction, right? And one of the things that's happened in this country, in recent years, is that entrepreneurs who might have a really promising startup technology can't get funding. There is not enough funding from the federal government, and so they wind up going to foreign funding, and we lose the technology edge. So, that's not in the US interest, it's not in our national interest. And therefore, finding the right tools to have both a government initiative. I mean, think of all the technologies that the United States dominates in today. Everything you're doing, whether you're taking an Uber, whether you're planning a road trip, all of this is working with technology that was created because we had to track the Soviets in space. And if you imagine what the world would have been like, suppose we said, hey, listen, government shouldn't intervene, we can't have an industrial policy, the space race is a democratic issue, and we shouldn't approve it in Congress. Can you imagine a world now today where the United States does not have satellites and only the Russians develop satellites? Can you imagine what it would be like as an American to live in that world where we had no satellites and we did not have GPS and we did not have Silicon Valley? Because that is the world we would be living in if we'd taken that same choice path back in the day. We're at that same kind of critical moment now.
And there's two great threads in this. It's a great discussion that I want to pull on. The first one, it's really around this, and Jason, you made comments on it earlier around industrial policy, the tension between getting there, the cleanest, fastest technologies into the system versus having domestic manufacturing capacity. And Amy's mentioning a lot to do with leadership in this. And I wonder if you could elaborate further on what you meant when I think the phrase was climate leadership and getting our house in order. I mean, what does that look like? What does it involve? Are we on the path?
Well, it was a somewhat separate point, and we're certainly not on the path, right? We're the gap between ambition and reality is growing, and it's great to see more ambition with people committing to stronger targets for 2030 and 2050, but we're not on that path. And the IEA projections, which are roughly consistent with work we've done at the Center on Global Energy Policy, if you think about what it takes to get to net zero by 2050. Roughly half the emissions in that scenario come from technologies that are not yet commercially available. And so we need a lot of work to do on innovation and to scale up technologies in a range of areas that will probably be harder to electrify, like shipping and aviation and steel and cement and maybe heavy duty trucking and parts of buildings and other things. So helping to advance those technologies and bring the cost down, that is some of what happened as a result of decisions China made. That's part of what happened as a result of decisions, say, Germany made with their Inaugural. And many economists criticize those policies because when you look at them on a cost per ton avoided metric, how much did you pay per ton of CO2? It was quite expensive. One consequence of it was that it brought the cost of, say, solar energy down for other countries to therefore adopt. I'll just say one other point too, which we can come back to, which is and I see in the questions, our friend Jamie Webster asked a question about this too. So pivoting to questions about electricity is the new oil, and just kicking the tires on that. So it is, I mean, it's not in the sense, obviously, that it's not substituting yet. Oil use is going up, not down, and hopefully that will change as things we can electrify, like light duty trucks and cars, begin to become more electrified, but we're not there yet. There are important differences between the two as well that I just wanted to highlight. One is, to the extent the transition means more of the energy system is electrified, I do think it means it's more localized. Electricity is produced locally, it's not largely traded across borders. The content, like solar panels and other materials, may be traded across borders, but the actual electricity is not. Coming back to the point I made earlier. We see vulnerability, obviously, in both systems, whether it's natural disaster like Hurricane Sandy to the fuel supply or to the electricity grid. Even there, the shortages we had at gas stations in New York were in part because the gas stations couldn't get electricity, not only because they couldn't access fuel into the port of New York, or a cyber attack, whether it's in the Ukraine on the electricity grid or with Colonial or with Aramco a few years ago. And then the last thing is the steps you take to think about resilience, I think, are different between the two. So we can store crude oil and a little bit more difficult refined petroleum products like gasoline and diesel. Obviously much harder to do that with electricity. We're not going to have a national electricity reserve. Probably there were different ways you could think about what that might look like, but not a big battery, I don't think. And the ability for the fuel system to be resilient. Think about what happened in response to Colonial this week. We have refined petroleum product stocks you could release. We could have more of those if we wanted. You have some fungibility in supplies where product can be trucked into the East Coast or imported from other countries. It's harder to do that when the electricity system goes out. So thinking about the steps you need to take to build resilience into your electricity system is different and maybe harder, but we should need to think about that.
I mean, I think it's really something that, the Texas electricity crisis really brings to bear. And Jason, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, maybe, the rule of thumb in electricity was that, the bigger the facility, the more economies of scale you get and the better you can lower the cost to all users. But as technology changes and as we digitize, that rule of thumb may go out the window. And you are getting to the point, I think, where, what the lesson of Hurricane Sandy is. There was this one little town in New Jersey that had its own grid for reasons that were peculiar. And they were back up in 3 days when the rest of New Jersey was down for weeks. And then if you happen to have an electric car and you were within 50 miles of that town, you could drive over to that town and charge up and go home and you're set. Right. So, but if you needed gasoline from a gasoline station, you were dependent on companies that just didn't seem to be able to get it together to have generation. So this question about, what is going to be reserve power? Is that going to be, we have extra capacity? If you think about the retirement of fossil fuels, do we keep some fossil fuels, mothballed but available in case there's an emergency? What is it that we're going to do? Are we going to have, distributed island battery systems that for vital facilities like military bases and so forth? Thinking about what that would look like and how we're going to implement it over time, I think is really an important thing to be thinking about now as we're planning the energy transition. And, the great thing about solar is, I guess you could, crack up my panel, but you're not going to be able to cut off the sun, right? So, how do I integrate solar so that at least part of the day, I have some resource, and then what do I do as my backup beyond that?
Amy,
I'll just make a quick comment. Oh, sorry, David.
David and then Jason, please. Thank you.
I was going to say, Amy, you write about vehicle to grid technologies. That got my attention in part because I serve on the board of a vehicle to grid company and it's been following this. And Ford's announced that its F-150, which is the best selling vehicle in America, they're going to put out an electric F-150, and it's going to be bidirectional, meaning you can take your F-150 and you could power your home with it for roughly a day or so. And just think about what the Texas electric grid situation would have looked like if there were millions of bidirectional electric vehicles out there. It could have been a very different situation. So as just one example of the point that Jason was making earlier about a distributed energy system with electricity, it's going to have different resilience components to it.
And they're seeing that in South Australia with the new facility. They call it virtual power plant, write about that in the book as well, where you have, you know, a whole community. Imagine a bunch of apartment buildings and everybody has something the size of a washing machine in their home that's a storage device, or their car is plugged in and it's a storage device. And then you aggregate it, and the aggregator buys 30% of your extra capacity of your battery. And then when there's some kind of an outage, it's aggregated together, and that's your so-called virtual power station to get you by a moment when the wind's not blowing or there's, you know, the grid's down. And, you know, in South Australia, where they had regular brownouts, they put in that system, and they have not had any brownouts as a result of using it. It worked unbelievably smoothly. So there are these sort of new ways of organizing electricity. Of course, it means complete pricing reform, right? In terms of how we reward utilities and what those rules are. And New York City, you know, other fellow at the CGEP, Richard Kaufman's given this a lot of thought. I know Melissa's given it some thought. So there really is a lot that could be done. And there's just a lot of opportunity, and grabbing that opportunity and not just sort of taking the momentum of, you know, somebody's business, but actually trying to think about, that's when I think about industrial policy. I think about, if I'm going to be regulating electricity prices and electricity utilities, you know, how do I incentivize the technologies I want, instead of just, you know, like leaving it to the market to decide? How do I get the desirable result?
I was just going to put a quick footnote next to the example about the town in New Jersey, and maybe Amy disagrees, which will make the discussion more interesting. But I wouldn't want people to take away from that the idea that resilience comes from being disconnected. I actually think the opposite is the case. And I think we see many examples of that. Often, as you know, Amy, the phrase energy independence is used and misused, and a sense of isolation is what gives you security. I actually think being more interconnected into an energy system, and it probably didn't help Texas that ERCOT was disconnected, actually can be a good thing. So if a disaster like Fukushima strikes Japan, their ability to be connected to a global energy market that allows them to pull in supplies of natural gas, or even even in their case, coal, to deal with that outage, made their energy system more resilient. The same when a hurricane like Katrina or Rita hits the Gulf, the fact that we're part of an interconnected global energy market where tankers can turn in response to price signals and find their way into the Gulf Coast to help supply the product we need. All of that makes us more resilient, not less. And I worry that independence is too often framed as disconnectedness rather than interconnectedness, which I think is where security comes from. We've seen that in Europe, right? Which is often as you know, we're dependent on Russian gas and Nord Stream 2 and all of this, but the steps Europe has taken in the last decade to build a more interconnected gas grid with more reverse flow capability and everything else is actually what has helped increase the security of supply, in my view, in the European energy market.
And Amy, I think you agree, because I saw you nodding, but just wanted to give you a moment to comment.
I totally agree. I mean, I think what we want to have is a mixture, right? So absolutely, you know, part of the stability of the system is to be able to have all this trading, whether that's cross-border electricity trading, or whether that's trading in different fuels. Obviously, the more fuels we use and the more backup systems we have, the more likely we are to have a event not be significant. If you think about it, if we had more EV charging on the road on the eastern seaboard today, this problem with Colonial Pipeline would be a little less onerous, especially when you consider ride sharing, right? Easier to, you know, take out my smart device and get transportation from someone who would be electrified instead of on a liquid fuel. So all those things are good, but we have these new systems that are designed to supplement the grid, like, you know, these backup systems, and they can be very clean. I mean, they can be integrated smart homes that use geothermal. You've got some innovative companies that are, you know, biodigesters are hard to do. When I lived in Davis, California, we used to separate our food waste, and it went to the biodigester and generated electricity, and that was a great thing. It was a very difficult technology to manage and expensive, but you know, someday maybe there's going to be some kind of a trash masher in your own home where you'd be able to just throw your garbage in and generate electricity from your house. So from your own garbage. So I think that it's a combination of being able to come up with a system that utilizes the best of both. You know, I don't think I disagree with Jason. I just think that some of these newer systems that are smaller scale gives us flexibility, especially in times of emergency. And it's important to think about how to integrate them.
So with the 8 minutes we have left today, I wanted to make sure to integrate a few more questions. One, I'm going to paraphrase one from Mark Burke, who talks about the vulnerabilities that are in our delivery system. So we've talked about the Colonial Pipeline incident that's ongoing. We've mentioned the Texas blackouts and, you know, how integration may or may not have helped with that situation. Another one that he flags is the SolarWinds hack, which I'm sure we're all familiar with in this room. I certainly know that Amy is. One question, if I'm paraphrasing it for a bit, is essentially saying, you know, the systems that we're using for industrial control and with our, you know, just everything being connected and digitalized, they weren't designed with security at the center. Is this going to be something that actually pushes us back to the technologies we used to rely on? So is this going to be an anti-digital loop that we then experience next? So Amy, I'm going to pass it to you next and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, you know, great question and really timely. If those of you who follow me on Twitter, my tweet yesterday morning was that every energy company in the United States needs to go back and look at their authentication system across their enterprise. Because, you know, sometimes credentials are floating around in the dark web. And if your company isn't out there having some consultant look in the dark web to see if you're exposed, that's a problem, right? And, you know, one would hope the government's doing that, but, you know, it's a big world. You know, you should also be employing resources for that. So there are technologies that are available to solve for that problem. And, you know, I think part of the problem we have in the United States is that some of the companies that have put in automation, it would be very expensive to take that equipment and put the extra security level of software against it. And so they didn't bother because, you know, what are the chances? And, you know, what are the chances of what are the chances? You know, the answer is no. If you, there are great efficiencies, especially environmental performance. And that's why this question of, you know, environment and digital is so critical, because for an oil and gas company, you know, digital could be unbelievably enabling to prevent water contamination, because you're going to know where your fluids are flowing. You're going to use sensors. High sensors can be used to, you know, find and detect and eliminate leakage of methane. But again, if you're going to use those systems, you know, cybersecurity should be the first question you ask, not the last question you ask. And, you know, I do a lot of work with corporate boards. And honestly, this is a board level area. The board should be overseeing, whether it's in the strategy or on the governance committee or somehow, there should be a high emphasis on knowing what the cyber capabilities are of your systems. If you're putting in new systems that are going to be automated, the lesson of Colonial is that it's not good enough to just say, oh, I've got a firewall between my office, you know, my one person in my office's computer and my operational software, because these ransomware teams have been known to be able to jump the fence. And so, I mean, there are technologies that go in, but again, not to overemphasize the point, but we only have a couple minutes left. That is why the United States needs to be leading. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is not a new energy or old energy issue. This is about the best protection we have against cyber intrusion and the ability to use digital technologies to have a convenient and cleaner life is to have superior capabilities in this domain. And that's across all industries.
Thanks for that. And I'll say,
Just,
of course.
sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead, Melissa.
Now, I was just going to quote Paula Gant over at the Department of Energy. Just put a kind note in the Q&A if you hadn't seen it, Amy, talking about how important this topic is and how timely, and how she's certainly turning her team to read this in short order at their virtual desks. So Paula, thank you for that comment. Jason, did you want to follow up with your comment? And then
I was just gonna, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I was just gonna ask Amy to respond to one thing that also relevant to what's a question that's come in from someone you know well, our super smart colleague, Julie Marino, who runs the Women Energy Program with you, pointing to the energy use, say, of blockchain. And I think the broader question there isn't just about cryptocurrency, but about unintended consequences and whether digitalization is kind of an equal opportunity revolutionary force. Obviously, the oil and gas industry has used digital technologies pretty effectively to reduce the cost of extracting oil and gas. There are many other ways I could imagine digitalization would lead to increased energy use or help in ways that might cut against our goals of reduction in carbon emissions, in the same way that, you know, when you add new lanes to highway, it doesn't actually reduce traffic because traffic returns to the prior equilibrium level. Is there a sense in which bringing down the cost, making things more efficient, starts to play out in ways that creates lots of new opportunities for people to use energy and potentially cuts in the other direction?
I think you're muted, Amy.
You know, blockchain, like all the digital technologies, is both enabling and could be a problem. Because if you're doing supply chain tracking with blockchain, and you have something goes wrong and there's a way for an intruder to get into that, then they're going to get back into your hardware, right? So, but on the other hand, you know, it's enabling.
Sorry, I thought I took the question to mean energy use, not security.
Oh,
meaning your view that digitalization takes us in a lower carbon direction. I think there's a flip side to that potentially.
100%. I agree, Jason, and you're right. And there are people who are experimenting with, you know, is there something? There's some science that goes beyond my knowledge, but I try to explain it in the book, because the very same radio waves that we're going to use to implement 5G, which could be unbelievably energy intensive, because you're going to have many more towers and much more much more data centers and everything to operate all these self-driving vehicles, and all the 5G systems is much more energy intensive. And so the question is, people are working on having the same frequency that is transmitting the data can actually transmit the energy, and therefore sort of become self-propelling. And that's, again, you know, great thing that the US government should be focused on in our infrastructure bill and in our R&D. Big priority should be exactly to enable some of these new technologies that would mitigate the data centers. And David mentioned, you know, using stranded methane. The other one, which is now being done by Google and others, is instead of buying renewable energy credits, they're literally physically putting renewable energy on their data centers so that they are not emitting.
Well, I know in your book, Amy, you speak about, you know, the potential for digitalization to increase efficiency, or depending on consumer behavior and a whole host of other things, actually increase our use, which is one of the things you just highlighted right there. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. David, I will just flag for you that we have a lot of questions about supply chains. I think you kicked off a perhaps whole other event on that topic, because there's a lot of them, and it's really a critical topic for us to discuss and get our hands around. But I just want to thank everyone again, all of our speakers, for joining us today, and for the audience for tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event is going to be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. And Amy's book is now available online, so it is just a click away for those of you who don't have it away. Congratulations again, Amy, like huge achievement, really great book, and just congratulations. I know it's so much work went into it, and it's wonderful to see such an accessible and such an important book come out at this time. Next week, I just wanted to flag that we're going to be hosting our 7th annual Columbia Global Energy Summit. The summit will begin on May 18th and run for 3 days, and will feature a whole lineup of very high-level speakers for some fantastic discussions. So Gina McCarthy, Fatih Birol, there's an entire list that you can see online. So I would encourage everyone to register. It's free, and you got a flavor for how discussions at CGEP go within this discussion today, and I can promise a lot more interesting discussions next week. Thank you again. And with that, we'll say goodbye. And thanks to all our speakers and our audience.